How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the 4th episode of Subskull, whatever we're going to call it. And the episode today is about elemental ailments. 2 episodes ago, episode 2 of this series, we did talk about damaging ailments and damaging ailments over time, specifically ignite, poison, and a little bit about bleed. Complementary to that, we're going to be talking about the other elemental ailments today, which are namely chill, freeze, shock, sap, scorch, brittle, and sometimes why. I think especially with the change to brittle coming up in the next patch at time of recording, this is a great time to refresh our understanding and our knowledge of these ailments. So, as always, what the heck is an ailment? An ailment is a detrimental effect. It's bad, it's not good, associated with one or more damage types. Ailments are similar to debuffs, but they are not synonymous. The most notable difference is that ailments are typically inflicted by hits made up of their associated damage types, whereas debuffs are applied by skill effects. Typical Path of Exile wording, typically inflicted by hits. You know, if we're talking about chill, you can be standing in a chilling area. None of these things are cut and dry. By and large, they're typically inflicted by hits, but I would even say at this point in the game, I wouldn't even say typically inflicted by hits at this point. There are so many different sources of these things that I would just say their original inception of their sources, you know, hit with a cold spell and get chilled or frozen. That's the way that it kind of started. But now there's chill on the ground. There's chill from all sorts of different things that you can walk through. Laser beams that can inflict shock on you, stuff like that. Okay, list of ailments. Ignite, chill, freeze, shock, scorch, brittle, and sap are referred to as elemental ailments because they are associated with elemental damage types. Bleeding and poison are non-elemental ailments. We will not be talking about those today. Damaging ailments are those that inflict damage over time. These are always damage over time. There are no damaging ailments that are not damaging over time. And we're talking about non-damaging elemental ailments today. Bleeding, poison, and ignite, we're not talking about. The non-damaging ailments that we're talking about today, chill, freeze, shock, scorch, brittle, sap, and sometimes why. We know about ignite. If you saw the previous episode, it is by default based on a fire hit that then gets inflicted by a crit, or if you have chance to ignite. And it always has to be based on fire damage unless you have something cold damage or non-fire damage can inflict ignite. Scorch is the alternate ailment. They're the alternate ailments. Scorch, brittle, and sap, they're replacements. They're alternate ailments where typically most of the sources of being able to inflict these ailments, they are actually mutually exclusive with your chance to originally inflict them. So if you originally would be igniting, that gets replaced and then you will be scorching. Same thing with brittle for chill and freeze. It'll usually be worded along the lines of like, you inflict brittle when you do cold damage. You cannot inflict chill and freeze. It'll say something along those lines. Same thing with sap and shock. There will be these 2 categories. The alternate ailments were added in Heist League. There are items that allow you to inflict those. They are not by default in the game. Scorched enemies have their elemental resistances lowered by up to 30% based on the fire damage of the hit. The base duration is 4 seconds. Scorched enemies have their elemental resistances lowered by up to 30% based on the fire damage of the hit. The base duration is 4 seconds. So let's look at Scorch. Scorch is an elemental ailment associated with fire, causing them to lower their elemental resistances. Very similar to exposure. To achieve the maximum magnitude, the player character needed to deal damage is 0.6 to the power of 2.5 times 100% of the ailment threshold, which is roughly equal to 28% of the threshold. So that's a big chunk, right? So to hit that 30% scorch, you have to do 28% of their life in a single hit. That's pretty chonky. If you can hit really, really hard, that just means your future hits are going to be even harder, right? It is Scorch, I think, is one of those ailments that people have started to play around with a little bit more recently. There's the boots from Maven that give you Scorch, I believe. You can also get Scorched Ground. You can inflict Scorch with a couple other mods that they've added recently. It's really, really strong. I think it's kind of slept on. It's good to know that this ailment exists, but the big thing to remember is, especially with Scorch, Brittle, and Sap, it's about the size of the hit. In this case, size matters. And then based on the help text, -10 elemental resistances is the values for the default Scorch. And then you'll have items like Legacy of Fury that will have 50% increased effect, so that 10% will go to 15%. So for the items that just give you Scorch, it will just give you a baseline. Let's go over to Chill. So what it does is it reduces animation speed. If you don't know about animation speed, if you've used Tailwind or other animation speed modifying things. I think Elder's Slow is also an animation speed reducing thing where very few things can stop reduced animation speed besides something like you can't be chilled or something to counter it very directly. And so in animation speed is just like, it's a full multiplier like at the on everything. So it slows down everything that you do. It's like when you're chilled, you know you're chilled, and it feels really, really bad. Regarding mechanics, a hit of cold damage will attempt to inflict chill. This will occur regardless of whether or not it crits. By default, only cold damage is able to. Some skill effect modifiers, such as Chilled Ground and Skitterbots, apply it without dealing damage. The base duration is 2 seconds, and its effect is determined based on the amount of cold damage dealt relative to the ailment threshold. And we'll see this a lot as we talk about these ailments. It's about the size of the hit, and then based on how much life that they have. So, you know, very, very early on, if you're able to do, or, you know, you're just doing yellow mobs in a T16 map, if you can do, you know, 25% of the monster's life, you're going to often get very close to max of the ailment. Whereas if you're only doing like 5% on Cirrus, and we'll do some demonstrations, you'll see that you're only getting a fraction of that. Chill's effect is capped at 30%. Chill's minimum effect is 5%. Any chill of lesser effect than that is discarded. That's also a good thing to know. A lot of things in Path of Exile, if they will just round down. We saw this with Ignite. If an Ignite, I believe it was 300 milliseconds. If the duration of Ignite was less than 300 milliseconds, it just says, nah, throw it out. Same thing here with Chill. If it's less than 5%, doesn't even bother applying it for a single frame. The effective chill is calculated with this formula, where D is the cold damage dealt, T is the enemy's ailment threshold, and M is the sum of the attacker's increases to the effective chill. This is an important thing that is kind of unique to chill here, is effective chill. And in all of these equations, we'll see this, is you can scale the effect in a way that you can counter the fact that you're not hitting really hard. That's why things like Unbound Ailment support that will scale the effect when you have it linked to like Bone Chill, if you're like a cold damage over time occultist, is actually very, very useful because, you know, with Vortex, you're not hitting really hard and the default chill effect is not at its maximum. So you can just use something like Unbound Ailments to scale that chill effect and get it closer to the maximum of 30%. In the great majority of cases, a monster's ailment threshold is equal to its max life. We already talked about this. Resulting chill effect, percentage of enemy's ailment threshold, which is, you know, usually the monster's life. So you have to do 27.89%, very, very similar to Scorch that we just saw, to do the maximum effective chill. However, right, we have chill effect here that we can use to kind of counter that, because very rarely, especially if you're like a cold damage over time character, are you doing 30% of a monster's life in a single hit. An interesting thing that kind of goes hand in hand here is when a target is frozen, it is also considered chilled, unless the damage that caused the freeze cannot chill. Sometimes that can happen. As the target becomes unfrozen, chill will remain on the target for an additional duration of 0.3 seconds. Some modifiers, such as Chilling Conflux, or the modifier found on the 3 dragons, your fire damage can shock but not ignite. The key here is your cold damage can ignite but not freeze or chill, but your lightning damage can freeze but not shock. Can change which damage types are able to inflict chill. If the player is able to chill with multiple different damage types, the chill's effect is determined by the total damage. So, if you have the line, if you're an elementalist, for example, and if you have the line here of, right here, Shaper of Winter, all damage with hits can chill. Even if you're hitting with Blade Vortex, that's doing physical damage. All damage with hits, even with fizz damage or chaos damage, you can still chill, and that will get added to the cold damage as for the chill effect, which is really cool. And that's why these Shaper nodes are so interesting. So modifiers to chill effects such as % increased effective chill apply to the effect of the chill before minimum or maximum chill effect is enforced. This means that increases to the effective chill effectively reduce the amount of damage needed to apply both a minimum and maximum chill, which is great. For example, a total of 100% increased effective chill would reduce the amount of damage dealt to 0.06% of the threshold and reduce the required damage dealt for maximum chill to 4.93%. Unless otherwise specified, all sources of chill that apply without dealing damage have a base effect of 10%. You'll see this as well with all of these is when you see something that says nearby enemies are chilled, nearby enemies are shocked, they will just have this base effect. A lot of people use Brittle boots right now, and there is just a base amount of Brittle that you are getting from those boots that then you can get Brittle effect or non-damaging ailment effect that then can scale that. The chill ailment is applied after the hit, not before, because the magnitude of the chill is based on the damage dealt. This is also very important. If you're just going for a single big hit on a cooldown, if the hit does damage based on if they're chilled, you want to hit a second time, right? So that first hit is going to be smaller if you do damage based on if they're chilled or not. So that's also very good to know. All right, and then freeze, the sister ailment to chill. If you've played Path of Exile, you know about getting frozen. Getting frozen sucks. Freeze prevents the affected target from taking actions. Based on the cold damage of the hit, the base minimum duration is 0.3 seconds, and the base maximum duration is 3 seconds. Freeze, known in status as frozen, is an elemental ailment associated with cold that slows action speed by 100%, completely preventing the target from moving, attacking, or using any skills. It is possible to counteract this with flasks such as of heat and the unstoppable passive node, right? So the key thing is that it reduces your action speed by 100%. So things that say action speed cannot be modified below the base value will counteract that, which is pretty sick. Knowing things like that are just like, hey, I really hate getting super slowed during the Elder fight. You could just use Combs Roots, counter that, a nice little tool in your quiver. All right, mechanics. A hit of damage that has a chance to freeze is capable of inflicting freeze. Critical strikes inherently have a 100% chance to freeze. By default, only cold damage can freeze, but certain things, like the 3 dragons, which can change what damage types can inflict freeze. Base duration is 0.06 seconds for every 1% of the target's maximum life before party scaling, which is good to know, right? So freezing in big party play, like Empyrean Snap OW groups, they still get the full freeze even before the party scaling. And they take advantage of that by using, Southbound gloves and Magic Find and all that type of stuff, up to a maximum of 50%. So this is much, much simpler than the previous ailments that we looked at. It's just 0.06 seconds for every 1%. And then the cap is up to hitting the monster for 50% of their life. And then they're frozen for 3 seconds. But usually if you hit a monster for 50% of its life, you probably don't have to worry about it being frozen for 3 seconds. Freezes with a smaller duration of 0.3 seconds are thrown in the trash, effectively requiring a hit of 5% enemy life. As an example, a mob with approximately 20 million life requires a single hit of at least 1 million cold damage to cause the minimum freeze duration of 0.3 seconds. It's also extra hard to freeze bosses, so they have additional anti-freeze stuff on them as well. They've changed this a number of times. Sometimes in the history of me playing PoE, we've seen bosses freeze quite a bit. Here we go. Currently, there are only a few selected enemies in the game that are immune to freeze. That is Rigwald, the Wolven King. While not immune to freeze, other selected monsters have a minimum action speed that they are set to if they would otherwise be frozen, including every other thing in the game. You can freeze them, but even while frozen, they're just moving slower. You'll see them slow down when you freeze them, but not that much. The enemy can still be frozen, but they're gonna keep moving, which is, kind of a weird thing. When a target is considered frozen, it is also chilled, unless the damage that caused the freeze can't chill. We saw this. Temporal Chain Curse slows timers, but does not affect duration stats, which means that it does not count toward the 0.3 second minimum, but it will cause the real duration of the freeze to be longer. Basic way you can think about that is it doesn't apply the temporal chains scaling until it says, will I apply this freeze? But once it is, then that timer will just tick down slower. If you've seen the way that temporal chains works, right, you'll see the buff or debuff on your character sheet in the upper left corner, and you'll see the number will go purple, and it'll just count 3, 2, 1, right? So it only lasts 3 seconds, but time is slowed down. That's the way that I think about temp chains. It's just a temporal shift in the way and the speed that time is actually passing for those buffs. Sounds like your sex life. Classic Jason. Non-unique enemies that are killed while frozen shatter into pieces. If you've played Herald of Ice builds that have especially Blast Freeze and Shatter Propagation, you know the joy of shattering a bunch of monsters in Path of Exile. They will still leave loot, but most other on-death effects are suppressed. It suppresses leaving a corpse. This is corpse destruction, which is really nice. Furthermore, there's no corpse to transfer status ailments with. So if you're doing regular proliferation, then you just can't because you're not being able to go through the corpses. Items with mods cannot be frozen, means 100% chance to avoid being frozen. Monsters with the mod cannot be fully slowed, can be frozen, but the action speed reduction, just like we talked about with the big bosses, they will still move, but while being frozen. Brittle. It is an elemental ailment associated with cold. Hits against brittle enemies have up to plus 15% chance to critically strike affected enemies. The key here is plus 15% base. Remember, based is the way that we want to live, right? So the way that everything works in Path of Exile is we have our base that then gets multiplied by the additive increases that then gets multiplied by each additional more, right? More, right? And then we have our final number. Base is before we start multiplying things. If you have 1 base crit and you multiply that by 20, right? Oh, I only have 20% chance to crit. Shucks. If you have 15% base chance, 15 times 20, I'm critting all day. I'm critting twice a day. You can only crit once. Don't get confused. Just having that base number that then you're increasing and multiplying is insane, right? It is so powerful. And that's why gems like increased critical strike chance support, and this is, hopefully this gives you some context for why Brittle is so broken right now. Increased critical strike support, right? This is an entire support gem. Whole support gem. You are not doing more damage. You are just getting chance to crit. 2%. This whole support gem that you're giving up damage, you're sacrificing so much, it's only giving you plus 2%. Brittle, 2%? Am I in kindergarten? Oh, am I sipping a little juice box? I'm out here slapping 300 dicks full of crits, 15%. You can crit with scaling almost no other crit. This is why it's broken. You can currently scale just a little bit and for free. Like you just take like 1 crit node, boom, I'm at basically 100% crit. It is giga broken right now. And they are nerfing Brittle to, I believe, 6% cap in next patch. Let's actually take a look right here. Brittle will now go up to 6% and has a default value of 2% instead of 5% to 15%. Still very good. 6% base crit. Remember, it is still 3 times the base crit of an entire support gem. Is just not auto-include now. Whenever I talk about balance changes, it's about looking at things that people are just auto-including. They don't have to think about what goes into their build. It's just, oh, I want to crit. I can't crit. What do I do? Slap Brittle on the build. You can just get Brittle ground on your boots now with a single Eldritch Orb. Boom. Right now I have a 100% chance to crit. It's just too free right now. I haven't seen a single person say that this nerf is unwarranted. I think even the people that love Brittle like understand how strong it is. As you can see, there is an equation here that will give you the magnitude of Brittle based on the cold damage dealt, the enemy's ailment threshold, which as we said is usually their life. And then there are lots of sources of it. You can get the heist alternate base types that will give you Brittle when you block, which is kind of cute. I do think these shields are a little underused, actually. They're pretty cool. I forget about them myself. Sublime Vision can have Brittle on it. Watcher's Eye. Gale Sight, as we said before. And then the big one that a lot of people do is either Leadership's Price or Secrets of Suffering. Leadership's Price will give you the Conflux. You can have Secrets of Suffering, which will just replace what critical strikes do with Scorch, Brittle, and Sap. If you have died in Path of Exile and had no goddamn idea why, I encourage you, record your gameplay. Look in that upper left corner. If you see a dude powering up like Goku, charging up his laser, his Kamehameha, you will see a lot of people kind of just sleep on shock, right? Because Ignite, oh no, I'm burning. Feels bad. I hate burning. A lot of people, they'll get anti-Ignite flasks. They'll do, avoid Ignite. Freeze. Game is literally unplayable. Literally. It says unplayable as the saltiest Reddit post you've ever seen. For Freeze, definitely Soul of the Brine King. Can't recommend it enough. Cannot be frozen. 50% reduced effective chill on you. Solves that problem, right? And that's why Solar Brine King, I use it 99% of the time. Shock, it's a sleeper. However, it is how you die. Shock causes the affected target to take up to 50% increased damage from all sources. So if you're familiar with, nearby enemies take increased damage, using Bottled Faith, using Pride, you know that increased damage is an additional multiplier that is very, very strong. And Shock goes up to 50%. And I generally prioritize getting anti-shock on any build where I don't want to die. So yeah, this one is very, very simple. A hit of damage that has a chance to shock is capable of inflicting shock. Critical strikes always inflict shock regardless of the chance. Modifiers to chance to shock can be found on some gems, equipment, and the passive tree. By default, only lightning damage is able to inflict shock, but things such as shocked ground and summon skitterbots also apply shock without dealing damage. The base duration of shock is 2 seconds, and its effect is determined based on the amount of lightning damage dealt. Shock's minimum effect is 5%. Anything less than that is discarded. Shock's effect is capped at 50%. Playtesting estimates the ailment threshold of Cirrus to be 25 million damage, or approximately 35% of boss life. You can actually get moderately good shocks on the bosses. Shock is actually a nice little damage boost if you're able to squeeze in a shock. That's why you see a lot of people using skitterbots. But the way that you can think about this, shock scales very, very easily and very quickly. You can get a 20% shock for only a 10% hit on the monster. That is a gigantic increased damage taken. And 30% if you're hitting for 27% damage. It's really, really, really nice. And then you can also get increased effect of shock, which will scale that even better and even easier. To get a 50% shock, you actually have to do 100% of the enemy's life as damage. Remember, this is all non-bosses. It's a very different scaling on non-bosses. As you can see, without scaling the effect, you won't ever reach a 50% shock effect, which is the cap, right? Shock has the default to cap out at 50% increased damage taken. And the only way to do that is by killing the monster. So you can't do it. But you can do it by scaling the increased shock effect, which I believe is M in this calculation. The shock effect that you will do is just scaled, and it's just a straight additive scaling that is multiplied at the end. So a single multiplier that's additive. You can just scale this number, basically. If you hit a monster for 17.68% of its life, you will, without any increased shock effect, you will inflict a 25% shock on them, which increases the damage taken by 25%, which is usually very, very good. It's just another additive more multiplier at the end of the damage equation. So if you have 100% increased shock effect, right, it's just an additive multiplier at the end. That will just give you a 50% shock if you do 17.68% of the monster's life. You can see it's just a single multiplier at the end. So if you have 100%, it's just going to be double, and then you will double the amount. If you would normally do 25%, you will double that to 50% if you have 100% increased. Very simple scaling on this. All right, so if we go to Lightning Conduit here, you'll see that it does 10% more damage with hits. So specifically with hits. So 10% more damage with hits per 5% shock effect on the enemy, right? So you take the damage that Lightning Conduit would do, and you just multiply it times 1.10 per 5% shock effect. If you have a 50% shock, it will be 100% more damage. That is a very big multiplier. And the other thing that they're scaling with here is with overcharge support, right? So shock enemies as though dealing 690% more damage, although you will deal 25% less damage. So you can use overcharge support to hit for way, way less, but still hit that threshold, right? Pretend like you're doing 690% more damage to try to hit that threshold for shock, right? So in this equation, instead of your normal damage, multiply it by 690%, then do this equation, and that's how big the shock is going to be. And then you can use that to calculate the amount of damage that you're going to do as this more multiplier with Lightning Conduit. The alternate sister ailment to shock is sap, and it actually is very well designed. So Scorch versus Ignite, there's no theme there, right? Chill and Freeze versus Brittle, there's no theme there, really. Shock and Sap, they're perfect inverses of each other. I actually think this one is beautiful. And Sap is like very, very underrepresented, primarily because most people aren't doing lightning damage right now. Anyway, if they are doing lightning damage, they do it because they can scale a lot of damage and they don't want to give up shock. If you're doing lightning damage, that's how you're doing a lot of damage. Sap is an elemental ailment that causes the affected monster or entity to deal less damage. It is straight up just the inverse. So it is just a less damage multiplier up to 20%. And that's really good. That's actually an incredibly good defensive layer. As we know, right, just having an additional elemental res, anything like that, just a nice little percent less damage does scale into making your character much, much tankier. And if you're able to sneak in Sap defensively, it is really, really, really good. It is the red-headed black sheep of the elemental elements. This is another reason why we don't see Sap too much. As always, if you have any like specific questions that I don't answer here, the answer is probably in the wiki. They do a very good job of consolidating a lot of sources of things. If you just want to know like, hey, I'm inflicting Sap, right? Like I'm using Thunder Sight. Hey, here we go. Boom. Hot take, new build, 3.19. My recommended league starter, Thunder Sight with Algor Mortis and Doriani's Fist. Boom. This is the don't take damage build. We're going to inflict maximum Sap on every single monster. We're going to one punch them, you know, make sure that they have 20% less damage done. And we're going to equip 2 pairs of gloves because we have 2 hands. That's the way that we play. The wiki is generally very exhaustive and very, very thorough. You can find, this is a great way if you're putting a build together, like, hey, I do want to build around Sap. How do I inflict Sap? Cool. We can go for the heist alternate shields. We can go for Thunder Sight or Leadership's Price. And then how do we scale it? Well, then we can go through here. We can look at the items that give us specifically increased lightning ailment effect and duration. It even tells you about passive points, passive skills, cluster jewels, stuff like that. A great way if you're starting to build around something, if you want to find some reference material. Ailments can be applied in other ways. Elemental proliferation causes the ailments to spread to other targets within a radius. Some things will proliferate through corpses. Some things will proliferate through pools that they leave on the ground. Do encourage you, this is a little bit out of the scope of the current lesson, but you can click on that wiki link and follow it to see how you can do that. Things like using Barracks Respite. But anyway, that as deep as I think I want to go for talking about all these specific ailments. So do elemental ailments stack if you hit a 10% shock and a 5%? No, you wouldn't have 15%. With things like shock or sap or anything like that, it will just keep the stronger one, the strength and not the duration. Can you apply more than one ailment with a single hit? Yes, very much yes. Thus concludes the 4th episode. The cap and gown for attending every episode of Sub School will be in a year or so. There's going to be a lot of lessons.